talk about some new features in Strudel. So I'm on warm.strudel.cc. Normal Strudel is on strudel.cc, and all of the new features that are being tested are on warm.strudel.cc. The three ones that are the topic of this video are LFOs, envelopes, and bus modulators. So all of these are set up to be very easy to get started with. I can just type .lfo. And get the prettiest pattern ever. Wow, okay. But also modulate the frequency of a signal. The most common way that LFOs decide what to modulate is they look at what came right before it. So in this case, I've written S for a sound source, and the LFO knows to interpret that coming first as let's modulate the frequency of that signal. Similarly, I can put the LFO right after the low-pass filter, and it will know to modulate the cutoff frequency of that low-pass filter. As you might guess, there is some defaulting going on behind the scenes that decide how to modulate that cutoff frequency when you write something simple like .lfo. If you want more control over the modulators, then may I present to you the reference. You can always click on this side panel over here to take a look at the reference. And let's start with LFO. There's a lot written here. And I recommend, if you're curious about these modulators, you take some time to read it in more detail than I can cover here. But what I'd like to do is go through some basic examples of what all of these parameters do. And as you can see, pretty much every parameter of this, and ultimately we'll see of these as well, lives under the config. The only one not covered there is the ID. The config is an object, so it would be written something like this. This is slightly different from how things typically work in Strudel. Typically, you write functions like this, and behind the scenes, that is converted into an object like this. However, we thought there's a lot of configuration here, so it would be easier to write it directly as that object. And one benefit is we get to introduce a lot of aliases like this that don't have to worry about collisions with other names like release, so that people who are coding live can write these very, very quickly inside of an object. Let's go through these one by one. So I will copy all of them over. The first one is control. This was happening implicitly for all of the LFOs I already showed you. So if we go back to this one here, the control is S. That would look like this. Alternatively, I could leave the LFO in the same place and target the low-pass filter instead. This will even work for controls that you haven't explicitly written. So gain is always present on your pattern, even if you don't write it. Modulating that would sound like this, which gives you a tremolo-like effect. The next one is subcontrol, and it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to come back to that one later. After that, we get into some of the more interesting ones, like rate. So if I write rate here, that of course affects how quickly the LFO modulates the gain control. Remember that there are aliases for all of these, so I could write this more succinctly like this. The next piece of configuration is depth, which affects how much the control is modulated. Notice though that this is relative modulation depth. This depth of 1 means take the default value here, which is the note C2 or the frequency 65 Hertz, and go above and below that by half of that value. So like 32 Hertz above to 32 Hertz below. This is the default value. you can choose other values like 2 or 3. In the same way, if I look at low pass filter, a depth of 1 here means take this value, divide it by 2, 400, and go above and below by that number. So from 400 up to 1200. There are two things that you might want to change about this. Maybe you don't want to go above and below the value. You want to only go above, or you want to only go below. May I introduce to you DC offset? The other thing you might not like is this relative behavior. Maybe it's difficult to understand exactly what that would do, or you don't want it to be changing as a function of what value you have in here. For that, I give you depth absolute. So depth absolute is the easier one to show you right now. I just replaced depth with dA. While we're at it, I could have written dr for depth relative over here. We're now switching to depth absolute. And you hear no change. The reason is, instead of a relative change from 800, we're doing an absolute frequency change of 1 hertz, which is not that audible. I could instead multiply this by 800. And we're back to where we started. I can put values like 100 in here or 5,000. Now let's talk about DC. The default DC offset is negative 0.5. What does that mean? It means take 0, which would be the unipolar upwards version of an LFO, which sounds like this. And this is where the spectrum starts to help you. You can see the nominal value over here with the slight 100 hertz variation, and then the larger 5,000 going above that value. DC offset says take that unipolar upwards one, which by the way, you now know how to do with 0 here. And shift all of the modulation relatively by this value. So if I go -1, this is the version that goes completely downwards from that value. We can use a less intense frequency to show you what that looks like here. And the -0.5 default is the one in between. It goes halfway below the half from here and halfway above. You can put any value you want in here to shift the modulation upwards or downwards, and I invite you to play with other values. Next, we're into shape. So you can look at these spectra below and see that the modulation sort of looks like a triangle. That's because the default shape is a triangle wave. The other options that you have available to you are sine, ramp, saw, and square, and they sound like this. So you can see that the sine is a smooth sine wave, the ramp is a ramp upwards, the saw is the opposite, a ramp downwards, and square is a pulse wave that goes up and down. These can also be assigned based on numbers like this. Which can be nice if you want to use some other Strudel functions like IRAND. The next one is skew, which only affects 2 of the shapes, the triangle and the square. So the default skew is 0.5, and it's used to either bend the triangle waveform to the left or to the right, or to change the pulse width of the square waveform. Let's look at what some of those values look like. So you can see when the skew is 0, the triangle wave gets shifted to the left and the square wave has less on width to it. And then as we get to the right, the square wave is on for the majority of its cycle and the triangle is turned into a ramp upwards shape. While we're at it, I should mention you don't need to know all of these. It's a lot, so I suggest maybe taking a listen to it as I explain it now, but only using them when it's fun for you and when it serves the sound that you're trying to create. You can get a lot of the way just by doing .LFO with no config at all, or by changing things like the rate or the depth to suit your needs. The next config is curve, which affects how curvy your waveforms are. The default value is 1, and it still sounds like this. As I increase the value here, it raises the modulator to that power. So 1.5 would be more intense, like this. Or you can make it less intense, like this. Your mileage may vary. I personally don't use the curve parameter that much. The next one is sync. So this whole time we've been using the basic rate, which sounds fine for the most part. But if we have other elements in the track, like a kick drum, then you may start to notice that this is not in time with this. In some situations, that's exactly what you want. It can be interesting to have an LFO not in time with the other elements and gives it some liveliness. But if you want it perfectly synced to the other elements in your track, I recommend using the S or sync control. This will multiply by the cycles per second in such a way that this is happening twice every cycle. I can go higher or lower. The last ones are ID, FXI, and subcontrol. So all of these really tie in with being able to target specific things for your LFO. The ID is useful if you want to modify your LFO after you've already created it. So for example, I could go like this and change my depth from the default of 1 to a depth of 4. The way you do that is by saying for the updating LFO call, which one of these you want to target. One way we could do it is by putting an ID of 0 here. This says take the 0th or first LFO that I've written up here and change its depth to 4 sometimes. Pro tip, by the way, if it's confusing for you when sometimes is occurring, if you put a number inside there in mini notation like this, even though we're not changing that number, it'll visually show you when it's active like this. Similarly, if I don't want the 0th and I want the first LFO, I change this here and I get this. And you can hear it affecting the LFO instead of the frequency. If you have a lot of LFOs, it can start to be confusing which one is the 4th or the 5th. So instead you can give these names with that same ID parameter like this. Then inside here, I can modify it by name. And this too can be patterned like this. FXI is the FX index. So I should probably make a whole other video about FX, but that's this, where on warm.strudel.cc you can put multiple effects of the same kind in a sequence and change their order. So I could write something like I can modulate these inside an FX just like any other control like this. But what if I don't want to have to put the LFOs all next to the controls here? For that, you use the FX index to target a specific one of these rows inside your .fx. This is the 0th and the 1st and the 2nd. If I want to target this gain specifically, I can use the FXI parameter like this to set the sync rate, the relative depth, the control being gain, and the FX index being 0, 1 here, like this. Lastly, we're going to talk about subcontrol. To understand subcontrol, it helps to know that LFOs can modulate other LFOs. That would look like this. So just like putting an LFO after a normal control, this one infers that you want to modulate the frequency of that LFO, and you can hear how it gets faster and slower over time. If you want to modulate something in here other than the frequency, then you use subcontrol. So instead of the default rate modulation, we can modulate something like the skew, and that sounds like this. So you can see the wave changing from this downward skewed wave shape to the normal triangle up to the ramp up shape. Okay, that's all of them. So now you know everything about how to use LFOs in Strudel. What I want to do now is just play around with LFO so you can see how one would use this in practice. Then we can take a look at envelope and bus modulator. Now that you're an expert, I won't go quite as slow for those two, but we will try to quickly cover all of the parameters for those remaining two modulators. Let's play around with LFO. So you can see me modulating the wavetable, the low pass filter, the phaser, and the pitch. I can start adding effects. Maybe I want to add a delay at the end of this chain like this. And I can modulate delay time like this. Maybe I want to add a low pass filter at the end of the chain with cutoff 200. This one has a sync rate of 8, a shape of sawtooth, so it has a plucky character to it, depth absolute of 2000, and a DC of 0, so it only goes up from the 200 by the 2000. Okay, that covers LFOs. Let's take a look at envelopes. So if I look at the reference for env, I have a lot of things like I had for LFO, and all of these configs here that I'll copy over. So a large portion of them you already understand. We have the config object that contains control and subcontrol, and depth relative and depth absolute. So we can forget about those for now. We have fxi and the index for selecting a specific envelope. So all we have to look at is attack decay, sustain and release, the ADSR envelope, as well as these curve parameters. Let's go back to Wavetable Digital here. I can add an envelope like this, and that would sound like this. As before, this is selecting the control just before it, the frequency, and applying an envelope to the frequency, like a pitch envelope. I can change the ADSR like this. These can be patterned. These A curve, D curve, and R curve parameters change the snappiness, or whatever the opposite of that is, for each of these three. So I can make the attack more snappy like this. Same thing for the decay. These curve parameters are really good for making things like 808s. So if I have a sine here, in fact, let me make it a bit more audible for you. So I can use user and set up partials. This is additive synthesis. So I'll have the fundamental frequency and some overtones. Now I want to modulate the pitch. I can do a depth relative of 4, which means this is going 2 octaves, 2 times 2, above the frequency that we started with. That would sound like this. So here's what it would sound like without the decay curve. And here's how snappy it sounds with it. So I can modulate anything I want with the envelope. We could do something like distortion, like this. We can also do something like FM with a slowly increasing envelope, like this. And with that, you understand envelopes. The last one is B-mod. So you can look at that in the reference here. And again, it's very similar to the LFO and envelope. I can copy over the config for that one. So for bus, you kind of know all of it already. There is bus, which is the one new thing that we'll discuss in a moment. And then we have control, subcontrol, depth, depth absolute, DC offset like there was for the LFO, and FX index and ID. So nothing new here that I need to explain. But what's going on with this bus? Let me just take a signal. So the first thing about bus is there is a new control just called bus. And what that does is sends this signal to an audio bus. The bus ID is determined by what you write inside here. So I'm doing bus 2. The way it is in audio bus is by taking another pattern. Then we can write bus and declare which one we want. In this case, 2. Then I'm going to silence this pattern by doing dry 0, which means we don't want any of the dry signal to come through, and there's no wet signal, so we don't need to worry about that. So now this is playing through the bus below as a new pattern. What that means is I can do things like segment it. I can also add additional effects to this pattern like this. So the fun thing about this is you can send as many signals as you want to the audio bus, and they'll all be mixed into the output pattern here. For example, I could take this sine and duplicate it. I'll get rid of the spectra for a moment and replace it with, say, pink noise. I'm going to make it a bit quieter so it doesn't blow out our eardrums, and I'll also filter it a little bit. Now we'll have pink noise and the sine both being mixed in here. We can also make some interesting bass sounds by putting this sine at a very low note and really filtering this noise a lot. So let's try 80. I'll add a slider here so we can increase the noise as it goes along. And I can increase the distortion. And remember, we can use all kinds of the things that we've already tried before, like LFO. Which makes me want to make some hypnotic techno right now, but I will continue with the tutorial. Now that you know what bus is, we can talk about how it relates to our final modulator, bus modulator. So let me introduce another signal. I'll make this one a wavetable. For this one, I'll bring the spectrum up here. Let's hear what this one sounds like. So I can already try something interesting by taking this. Let's put it at the same note as our sine wave and sending it to the sine wave. The way that we do that is by putting B mod after the thing we want to modulate, in this case the frequency. And then inside here, we will declare the bus that we want to have modulate this signal. So I'm going to send this wavetable to a new bus 3, and I'll write B3 to indicate that we want to use that third bus to modulate it. I'm realizing that I need to add B as an alias to the documentation, but it is an alias you have available to you. Then I'll make this one dry 0 so we don't hear it. And you can hear how this signal is being affected. I can also use signals like this wavetable as an LFO. So let's take the note and bring it way down. I'll try first F-1. And then we can go way lower, even F-4. If you don't want to think in terms of negative notes like this, you can do something like frequency of 0.5. So that's about it. B-mod has a lot of the same controls like depth relative, DC offset, depth absolute, and so forth. And with that, you know how B-mod works, envelope works, and LFO works. I'm going to keep playing with this pattern because I think it's pretty fun. And I'll see you at the end of the video. off of a comment where someone asked if I could explain these things. So if you want something explained, feel free to say so in the comments.